Welcome, everybody. Really glad to have you here tonight for the next kind of episode of sorts of the America's Public Forum, which is co-sponsored by the National Institute for Civil Discourse, as well as Braver Angels. If you've been part of the conversations in the last few weeks, 1776 Unites has also been part of the conversations topically that were really the last few weeks around the issues of racism and race in America. So I would encourage you to check out the previous recordings of all of these events that are found on both the Braver Angels YouTube channel as well as NICDs. So you can find these if you just search for, I know on the NICD website on YouTube, it is under America's Public Forum. So you can locate those there, as well as tonight's America's Public Forum will be housed there in the near future. But thanks so much for being here this evening. We're really excited to have people. I'm watching people coming into the room, and it just kind of keeps going up. Really wonderful to see as many people kind of expressing interest in this. And tonight we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from two scholars who have done a considerable amount of work in kind of the intersecting areas that may be something familiar to some of you, but for many of you, I imagine this might be kind of a first step into some of the conversations that they're going to be discussing that intersect with your own kind of questions, especially as this work is really kind of grounded in your own lives and in your communities. And so tonight we have William Keith and Robert Danisch, the co-authors of the book Beyond Civility, The Competing Obligations of Citizenship. So I want to just say a little bit about them, and then really going to turn it over to them in a moment after I think we do some of the housekeeping, if there's anything else that we need to do, Luke, on that front. I think at this point we're mostly good to keep ourselves muted, and that's really kind of the operating standpoint that we're going to have. We will have places for discussion in just a little while. But just a bit about both of these authors. So William Keith is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He is the author of multiple works, most notably, and I was just saying a moment ago to many of you who were in here, a book called Democracy as Discussion. And for me, it was one of the kind of foundational texts that really gave some meaning to the work that I was trying to explore myself as a scholar, really interested in the development of the discussion movement in the 1930s and 40s. His text is a really critical one. That may be something that we can throw into the chat box a little bit later that might be of interest to some people. But Robert Danisch is also a wonderful scholar in his own right. Has written on issues of pragmatism, democracy, and rhetoric. The book that has been kind of at the top of my shelf in the recent past is a book called Building a Social Democracy, The Promise of Rhetorical Pragmatism, published in 2015. And so they both come deeply from, and he's at the University of Waterloo, a professor of communication and the chair there as well. They both come from a really grounded place in this idea of rhetoric and communication playing a vital role in defining and shaping how we see ourselves in community and what that means for something called democracy. And so their new book, Beyond Civility, really is an interesting argument as to why we need to think about this term that for many of us is rooted kind of one of these core concepts that shapes the way that we see ourselves engaging others across these lines of difference that are in our lives. But also some of the challenges and complexities to a term such as civility. And tonight, they've kind of provocatively pushed us a little bit towards this notion of radical civility. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill and Rob, and they're going to, I think if that's okay, I think we've got the housekeeping piece probably all set. And so we're going to have a chance for them to kind of lead the discussion, kind of a presentation, and then we'll take it as a discussion, kind of Q&A, and we will talk a little bit of the housekeeping of how we're going to do that. But I would encourage you again to make sure that you're muted at this time, and you may be inclined, if you're, depending on what device you're using, you might want to turn it on to speaker view just so you're able to stay focused on both Bill Keith and Rob Danisch. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. Tim, you guys know him. He's a great scholar. He's an amazing person, and the level of leadership that he's shown as an assistant professor at Kansas State University across all sorts of national contexts is really incredibly impressive. And I am just really honored to be able to participate today with this group. It's an amazing thing that you do this and that you're keeping the forum idea alive. It's about 100 years old, and I'm glad to see that it is well and healthy. So for me, I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. My PhD is from the University of Texas. I've worked kind of all over the country. And I got interested in these issues actually through pedagogy. I was interested, how do people teach certain things? And what is the history of how they teach it? And the discussion book came from wondering first about how certain university courses came to be. And what that led me to find out was that in the 1920s and 30s, there was a national movement for forums and discussion. And people thought really hard about, as America has increased immigration, as it becomes increasingly diverse, as it becomes increasingly urban, how do we talk to each other to keep democracy going? And they had a lot to say about it that was pretty smart in its own way and that we can learn a lot from. It led me to the Civility project because it turns out, and this may be a little bit invisible if you're not an academic, but in the academic world, civility is a bad thing. So to the extent that you care about social change, when people hear civility, they hear, oh, just be nice and let things stay the way they are. And this book is our way of trying to investigate that idea, to push back on a little bit, and to make it a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I want to echo what Bill just said and thank Tim and everyone that is involved behind the scenes in putting these sorts of events on. And let me thank Bill Keith, my co-author. The book is in many ways a product of a conversation between the two of us. And that's a good outcome. And it's been a civil conversation, I think, for the most part. It's proof that good outcomes can come from civil conversations.
We have the best fights.
So I did my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in Communication Studies. I didn't want to be a professor. I don't know how this happened, really. So it's an odd thing that I find myself here. I didn't want to be a professor because I was interested in very practical things. The central questions of all my work, I think, are very practical. I think of communication studies as a practical discipline, asking how questions often, how we improve our relationships with one another, how we improve our democratic forms of decision-making. So I came to this project with an emphasis on how questions, and with the question in mind in particular about how civility might aid social or political change. That's always behind all my work. How does change happen? How do we make change happen? And what communication practices sort of create change in our political and social lives? So that's how I approach this project. So let me just give a brief overview of what Bill and I will talk about today, and then we'll kind of dive in to the work. I think I want to start by saying some things about why civility matters. And as Bill said, in academic circles, civility is sometimes not a very valuable attribute or very valuable thing. For this group, it might be kind of self-evident that civility matters. But we want to add some context or some arguments to why civility matters. And then we want to talk about our kind of, our claim that strong civility is really what we want, or radical civility. And we make a distinction in the book between strong and weak civility and strong and weak incivility. So we're going to talk through what that distinction means and why it matters. And how, as kind of practicing citizens in a democracy, we can be on the lookout for forms of strong civility and forms of strong incivility and how they influence political culture or political decision-making. So let's start with the why questions. Why civility? Why does it matter? I think in answering this, in our work at least, there are two important distinctions that we want to put on the table and make everyone aware of. And the first distinction is about the term democracy itself. When most of us think of democracy, we think of a system of government. And that system of government might be a legislature, it might be a set of a local institution, it might be the federal government, it might be our rights that we have, it might be the Constitution, etc. But democracy isn't just a set of institutions. it's also a way of life. And this was something that John Dewey, an American philosopher from the late 19th, early 20th century, told us. As a way of life, it's a kind of mode of associated living. That was his words. Well, what did he mean by that? And I think for us in the book, we spend some time unpacking what this means, but to put it briefly, the question is how do we live well together with difference? And living well isn't just living well through institutions, it's also living well in a social space. And so the kinds of relationships we build in a democracy matter. The kinds of relationships we build with strangers in particular matter. So there's a kind of social fabric that underpins the set of institutions that we inhabit. And if the set of institutions is fully functioning and doing a great job, et cetera, but the social fabric is torn or damaged or defective somehow, those institutions won't work well. That's at least what John Dewey argued. The same is true vice versa. So if the institutions are broken or malfunctioning, but there's a strong social fabric, then the democracy still might not work well. So the problem of democracy is really a problem of matching a kind of healthy social system with a healthy and functioning set of institutions. And we can sometimes forget that. And so, you know, a lot of people on the left right now kind of assail the president of the United States for damaging American institutions. Well, that's not the only thing that's happening. There's also damage being done to the social fabric that underpins those institutions. So in part, this book issues from the idea that democracy is also a way of life, and preserving, improving, developing the kind of social fabric that underpins democracy is important work to be done. And that's one of the reasons civility matters. The second distinction we make in the book, which is a very important one to me as a communication scholar, is about the word communication itself. And that distinction is between communication as transmission of information and communication as a process of making meaning together. So if you ever are in conversation with someone and you ask them, oh, don't you get it? Don't you get what I'm saying? You're asking, I think, a transmission model of communication question. You're asking the other person if they receive the information that you're trying to send to them. Well, as communication scholars, that's not the only version, that's not the only way of understanding communication. And in our book, it's not really the principal way that we ought to understand communication. In fact, I would say we need to stop asking transmission questions when we're talking about communication. So if we're not transmitting information when we're communicating, what are we doing? And think about this in a political context. If we're not transmitting information about our preferences when we're in conversation with our fellow citizens, what is it that we're doing? Well, one of the things we're doing is we're forming relationships. So communication is also a matter of what we call relationality. And it's a process of coming into relationship with others. And meaning is a product of those relationships. And if meaning is a product of those relationships, the quality of the relationships really, really matter. So civility is introduced at this point as well, because civility is a mode of communicative practice that allows us to form positive or productive relationships with strangers. And that's a core kind of communication problem. So we think democracy is a way of life and that communication is a matter of relationality. And if you think about those two things, you realize that civility is really important to the functioning of a democratic society. So I think Bill's now going to expand a little bit on this and explain how this kind of works itself into a set of problems. Bill, so I'll turn it over to you.
Right, so what I want to do is take the framework that Rob just came up with and translate a little bit into a vocabulary that you're pretty familiar with. Everybody is, because people talk about this all the time, and I think of it as the problem of the common ground. And so it's really common for people to say, you know, back in the day, we had a common ground and we knew how to argue. And how do you argue with somebody if you don't have a common ground, et cetera? So there's two problems here. One is that people keep saying we can't make any progress until we have the common ground. The other problem is it doesn't exist. So that sounds like a radical thing to say, but I think it's not quite as radical as people would expect. So the thing is, the worry people have about the common ground is legitimate one. And it's that if you don't have some sort of fixed piece, then disagreements might go all the way down. And for a lot of people, the last 4 years have been a realization of that fear, right? That disagreements can all go all the way down. I just had a text from a friend that someone in one of the suburbs here, the kids are going back to school, but they have to wear masks. And she said, well, masks are actually a satanic ritual and my children are Christian and they will not be wearing masks. Okay, right? So I think nobody ever expected that. All these years it says no shirt, no shoes, no service, and that was okay. But now masks are not okay, right? So nobody expected to go all the way down there in that way. And so that's a real fear, but the solution is not quite what people think. I don't think we need a common ground because there isn't just one, right? So if there were, this would all be pretty easy. And the real problem is we deceive ourselves, because when we talk to people that we're in tune with and we have disagreements, there's a whole bunch of common things we rely on to make progress in those disagreements. And it's good, it works. And then we meet somebody we share very little with and we say, okay, so the problem must be that we don't share enough in common, right? That if we had this common thing. So if we didn't take it for granted, we could be saying, okay, there isn't a single common ground. It's something we produce in the context of interactions, in the context of a relationship where it's okay to do this, right? So this is a sticky thing, right? And if you've engaged these tough civic discussions, which is what your organization is about, you know you often go into it and you're just at sea. You're just lost. Like, where are the compass points here? What am I doing, right? And you have to figure out, like, how can we arrange to have something that is a point of reference so we can figure out what we're doing? And part of what we want people to accept is that this is a process that's never finished. You're continually renegotiating this idea of common ground. And when I say it like that, even to myself, it sounds exhausting, but I think it is the reality of democratic life that in a diverse society, we're going to have to be doing this. Now, the thing is, there are some cases where you talk to people about a disagreement, like healthcare reform, and people have common experiences. They've had interactions with the health system. They've been sick. They've worried about people who've been sick. They've wanted care for people who they love that they're not sure that they can get it. Those experiences can serve as a reference frame for how do we want to manage this in our society. So instead of starting with, well, you know, it has to be market or it has to be government or whatever, you start with what are our experiences and what mattered to us and build out from there. That's kind of the easy case. If you're talking about race, which I guess you all have probably, like everybody else, been doing over the last couple of months, that's a lot harder because people's experiences of racism are not that common. People have radically different life experiences. And even well-intentioned people, it is hard to find these common points of references. As a white person in society, I can say I understand, but I will never actually live my life as a minority person. So what do you have to do here? Well, you can start with talking about what are your general values. You can start with storytelling and listening and accepting what people say. You can start with facts about inequality. You can start big, you can start small. You have to work through something, and it may take a bunch of false starts to get to the place where you feel like you're making some kind of process. So if we can't make it easy, if it is a fact of life that we have to do this, how do we manage it? We're not going to solve for this. We're not going to say, okay, here's the common ground now forever, but we got to manage the process. So we think civility is that framework for managing the process. That is, how do you preserve relationships under conditions of difference and disagreement, right? Civility doesn't start with the idea that we're all the same. It starts with the idea that we're all different. If everybody has different tastes in music and food and what is a good life, how do we actually live with each other? Because almost everybody turns out to be wrong, except for me and my friends, right? So so how do I treat people who are different in these relevant, important ways? And civility says, I maintain a stance of generalized respect toward them that creates a certain kind of public relationship. And within that relationship, we can actually start to explore and make progress on problem solving, not on resolving differences. We don't have to be the same. We have to find ourselves enough in alignment that we can move forward. And so I want to make 2 points about civility. I mean, one of the points is that it can be confused with politeness. And so politeness is what we call weak civility. And so if you're just nice and you say yes and don't cause a problem and let it go, and if that's your stance, okay. But it isn't really a stance that's going to help you make progress on difficult discussions. It's actually a way of avoiding difficult discussions. And there are many, many circumstances, hello, Thanksgiving dinner table, where you should avoid this, right? That's not the time or the place. There are many situations where you should engage. Historically, civility has been about this public relationship, and originally, the history of it starts somewhere in the Renaissance. but it was actually a fairly narrow band of people who deserved this kind of public respect. You had very hierarchical European societies, you had royalty, all this stuff, and women were totally left out of it. People we consider minorities were left out, religious minorities left out, et cetera, like this. And the arc across history has actually become more and more inclusive, right? And if you just think back to the beginning of the American Republic, Jefferson only wanted male farmers who owned a certain amount of property to be able to vote. They're the only ones whose opinion should actually count. And obviously now a lot more people's opinions count. And this expansion of inclusivity creates more difficulties for civility, right? It gets more, as you get, diversity gets larger, it gets harder to maintain this stance and relationship. We have to work at it, and we have to become more skilled. So let me look really quick at a kind of like a tough case that people think about right now. And so we put this as the point, why should you be civil to a racist, right? And I'm not saying you should always be. There are moments where that's not the appropriate response, but can you always be uncivil to a racist? Or is there a point where something else can happen? Because if somebody, because you have to ask yourself, you have this reaction, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe you said that thing. And it's like, maybe these are racist beliefs or words, but is this person themselves fundamentally racist? Does it help anything to categorize them? Most people are more than one thing. And a lot of people who, in some situations, utter opinions that we find really dehumanizing and terrible. In other ways, they're kind, they're humane, they're generous. So if people are more than one thing, if they're complicated, can we find one of those things as a point of reference and work ourselves back toward the difference about the way in which they talk about people of other races? If a lot of people's reaction, I have this too, is you feel like either yelling at the person or shunning them, right? So you want to kind of shame them or shun them. Is there a purpose served by doing those things? There's moments where I could argue, yeah, there is. But the thing is, long term, can we shun everybody who's different in this way? What becomes a society if, you know, we just become two camps that don't talk to each other because each side thinks the other is completely wrong? Then we've lost the ability to make progress on problem solving together, which was the point of democracy, to have different points of view, but also this moment where people are together. And so, and the other question is, does maintaining the relationship open up possibilities for meaningful change? I definitely have friends who I think like, wow, the things that you say. On the other hand, I stay friends with them, not because I'm like secretly trying to change them, but that I hope as our friendship evolves, we orient ourselves to each other in a different way, and different ways of talking become possible. Some cases that's proved true. In some cases I've been disappointed, but that's how it goes. So I'm mindful, we're both mindful that tolerating racism does perpetuate it. And so, you know, we're not saying that you don't challenge people about this. The question of strong civility is, how do we challenge people on their values while maintaining the relationship without completely breaking it? That's really kind of the hard part. How do you do that? So let me switch here to something a little bit more practical. I'm going to talk a little bit about strong civility tactics, and Rob is going to talk about strong incivility. Here's just a couple things, and these are probably kind of familiar, but I want to recharacterize them in terms of what we're talking about. So one rule is, don't demonize people. Wow, you suck, you're terrible, you're one of them. Oh my gosh, right? So I understand the feeling, the inclination to do this, right? But in the moment with this given person, by thinking about them this way, you've dehumanized them. You've actually violated your own values. You've stopped treating them as somebody who is complex, who has many contradictory alternate lives in their own life and other things going on, and you've reduced them to this one apparently terrible thing that they said. And it was probably pretty terrible. That's okay. That's why you're mad. You have values. But is it useful for the process of communication here to change the relationship into one where I judge you? Stereotyping people, you know, oh, you're just one of those liberals, you're just another random conservative, whatever, I've seen you type 100 times. When you do this, again, you reduce complexity. And in some cases, you know, it's not always a negative judgment, but it's still a way of being inauthentic in the moment as you work with people. Listening deeply is hard, right? Like, and I'm sure actually this is something that you talk about, but when people say things that you find really extremely offensive, can you listen for, like, what are they worried about? Why is this hard for them? What are the fears that prompt them to say these things, right? It could be that as you explore those things, I still think you're wrong about talking about this group this way, but I get that you're afraid, and I share maybe some of those fears, but I don't think that's the right way to talk about the cause of it. Can we work ourselves around, right? There's other ways to do it if you listen deeply enough through the things that are making you mad in the moment. Can you sit with discomfort? Can you talk to somebody and hear things that you think are just awful and just work with it? Not approving it, not accepting it, but working with it in the context of the relationship and saying, if I can be flexible here, we can move toward a different place eventually, right? Because if you cut it off, if you won't sit with discomfort, is when you get this uncomfortable, you run, which people do, then you don't really have a chance. The other temptation now, and especially the current president is extremely guilty of this, you have to avoid the feel-good snark. I mean, man, it is amazing how we are trained by everything from sitcoms to, blog posts to Facebook, Instagram, all this stuff, the repartee and the put down. And man, that is a momentary feel good, but it is so corrosive to the relationship that will promote real discussion and real communication, right? And it really only takes one. And suddenly the person changes their orientation to you and you're not going to get that back. And so training yourself, as much as you may think these things, that they don't come out your mouth, and eventually maybe you don't even think them so much. Because there you're getting onto, there's weak incivility, there's strong incivility, there's little things that bother people, and then there's something in the larger picture. And Rob is going to talk a little bit more detail about that.
Yeah, so let me pick up a little on something Bill just said that I think is important. One of the outcomes of strong civility is that it allows you to confirm and maintain a relationship. And then once that relationship is confirmed and maintained, it opens up the possibility for that relationship to be improved and to be transformative for the participants in the relationship. This is something John Dewey, as a philosopher, really believed. He really believed that we were changed by our relationships with others. As a first step, you need to confirm and maintain that relationship, and then look for ways in which it might be improved and then ultimately be transformative for those involved with it. Strong incivility is in many ways the exact opposite of that. It's a mode of communicative practice that tries to disconfirm a relationship or break it or make it such that you cannot be changed by that relationship. You only see the person on the other side as different in all ways and outside of your your deliberative sphere. So let me say a few things about what strong incivility looks like on the ground. And here I think the distinction between strong incivility and weak incivility is the difference between an offhanded insult or a kind of one-liner and this deeper attempt to disconfirm a relationship or to kind of cut it off. And I'll say a couple of practical things here, and then I'll also put in a plug for my own podcast. So I have host a podcast called Now We're Talking that covers communication practices. And a bunch of these practices are covered in the podcast in more detail because I'm interested in what practices maintain relationships and improve them and what practices disconfirm or break relationships. Well, strong incivility is characterized in particular by three communication practices. The first is what rhetoricians call practices of identification and division. So identification is, for some people that study rhetoric, the key to persuasion. And what rhetoricians mean by identification is, say you want to buy a new car, you drive your old car into the parking lot of the car dealership, and the salesman sees in the back seat of your car that you've got some camping equipment. So you get out of the car and the salesman says, "Oh, I see you've been camping. I was just camping at so-and-so. It's beautiful." Why does the salesman do that? He wants to establish a sense of identification with you. He wants to make some sort of common ground, that thing that Bill was talking about before. So good people are good at communication, are good at creating identification. Well, the opposite of identification is division. So rhetoricians know, or at least when I teach my students, I teach them any identification also comes with a division. It comes with the sign that there are non-campers out there, and we are not we are campers and there are non-campers. So what happens with strong incivility is you get a set of communication practices that strengthen or thicken the bonds of identification between one in-group as opposed to another out-group. So there's a strengthening of the core set of identifications with the in-group, and an opposition drawn with an outgroup. And this is what's happening with polarization in the United States. Polarization is the product of a kind of repetitive series of communication practices that strengthen division between groups and that are built around those divisions. Well, strong incivility is built around these divisions as well, but with the attempt to eliminate the other side from practice of public discourse, so the practice of public decision-making. It's a way of demonizing the group that you've divided yourself from so harshly that you don't think they're worthy of engagement. So I think engagement is a key word here. I think what Bill was describing in terms of strong civility was this sort of deep engagement with difference. And strong incivility is a kind of disengagement with difference, a kind of attempt to say, that is so horrendous over there, that group is so outside the bounds of what I find acceptable, I won't engage with that group at all. So most forms of strong incivility are built around rhetorics of division and identification. But it gets more, I think, specific or more rich when you consider how those forms of division are supported. And I think they're supported by two main practices, or at least we say in the book, they're supported by two main practices. In communication, those are the practices of hyperbole and the practices of reification. Hyperbole is a form of exaggeration. It's a kind of way of heightening a characteristic of someone or something so that you draw attention to it. And you attempt to reduce that person or that thing to that one attribute that you've exaggerated. And hyperbole often goes hand in hand with overgeneralization. So, you know, all people that do X are Y. Surely that's not true, but it's this overgeneralization to draw attention to this one characteristic of this particular group. So if you're in a public consultation or a public deliberation or a forum of any sort, and you see someone engaged in hyperbole and overgeneralization, bells should start going off and you should start thinking, oh, now we have an instance of the disconfirmation of a relationship. We have someone trying to divide and sever off or cut off a relationship instead of maintaining it or finding some productive common ground in it. I think the second kind of component of more specific component of strong incivility is reification. That's also a fancy word for objectification. It's reducing a person to being an object. Instead of having agency and having multidimensionality, they become just an object. So the current president does this with women all the time. He objectifies them by reducing them to some characteristic, usually about their looks. And that is all, that's the only attribute that matters to them. So once you've objectified someone though, you've disconfirmed their multidimensional agency. And you've basically said, I'm not willing to have a relationship with that person in all of their kind of richness. I only see them as this one object, and therefore the relationship can't be maintained and it can't be transformative inside public dialogue. So if you see objectification or reification happening in public discourse, bells should go off again and you should think, oh, that's an example of strong incivility. It's a threat to the social fabric because what's happening is this kind of division between me and this other group or this other person or this other thing. And you can't maintain or you can't engage in a process that finds common ground when you've reduced the opponent to being just an object and not a multidimensional person. So I think that incivility sometimes we need to critique others. And we're not suggesting that critique is bad. And in fact, in the book, we talk about some forms of incivility that actually work. So forms of incivility can work as performances of profound critiques and can be transformative. But when it's practiced to disconfirm a relationship or to break off a relationship in a democratic society, that's dangerous. It tears at the social fabric. So that thing that we were calling a kind of democracy as a way of life is threatened by the overuse of strong incivility with these rhetorics of division, objectification, and hyperbole. So you might be on the lookout for forms of strong civility, the kind of deep listening that Bill was talking about, the kind of sitting with discomfort, the kind of avoidance of demonization, but we should also be on the lookout for these forms of strong incivility when engaged in public dialogue. And if we do that work, the process of finding common ground will be improved by avoiding forms of strong incivility and engaging forms of strong civility. So I guess the next question is why we need this. And let me turn it back to Bill, and he's going to try and answer that question, why we would need to engage with strong civility and avoid strong incivility.
I will unmute my own self. Yeah, so I think a lot of the pain that people feel over the last few years, part of it is historically justified, part of it's not. Right. So wasn't there a day when, you know, we had a national conversation and it was civil and we decided things? And no, there really wasn't. Right. So America is a country where people have always been feisty. They have had a rowdy democracy. Their public rhetorical behavior to each other, if you go back to the 19th century, is stuff that looks pretty raw, even by today's standards. Right. So that's OK. So if the thing is, though, that it is true that public opinion does inform democratic institutions. And, you know, one of the most trite things nowadays is like, we need to have a conversation about X. And people are like, well, everyone always says that. It actually happens sometimes. The last 3 months have been a conversation about George Floyd, but about so much more than George Floyd. And it's not that any of this was news, right? Not police violence, not systemic racism. Anyone who's been paying attention has been exposed to this. But people actually taking each other seriously about it and actually engaging it, and they engage it in different ways at different levels, that is real, and that will have an electoral, it will have an institutional impact. So we don't want to discount this idea of having this, right? So obviously media are to blame, and they deserve both praise and blame for certain things that go on, because the media do tend to foster or reject certain kinds of relationships. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. Let's have some fighting, right? That's not helpful to us. On the other hand, you know, boring discussions, no one pays attention and people get disengaged, right? So we have a lot of different problems floating around. But so we have to be able to talk to each other. So I sometimes think in some ways this comes down to the question of the line. So there, in a democratic society with all its diversity, there's going to be a line, and there are people who are across the line. Pedophiles, cannibals, we can all agree, not acceptable. This country decided, I think it was in the 1880s, that polygamy crossed the line. Utah wants to be a state, they have to give up polygamy. Right now, who's across the line? Nazis, probably. People who are not just like, we throw that word around, oh, crypto-Nazi, crypto-fascist. But people actually like, no, the things that Hitler believed, I believe those things too. So in the March on Charlottesville, there was stuff that was just completely across the line. There's a way in which things are across the line when a debate point can't be someone else's humanity. And so I don't have a lot of sympathy with people who want to debate about whether or not trans women are women. That doesn't seem like it's a fit subject. Now, how you want to deal with that is one thing. That's not a fit subject for debate. On the other hand, and here's where I'm making this distinction with Nazis, you know, J.K. Rowling, has the author of the Harry Potter books, has just been involved in this controversy about she doesn't believe trans women are women. I don't think that means she needs to be cast into the outer darkness and never heard from in polite society again. I think I want to listen to her and find out, is this born of ignorance? Is this a trivial belief? Is this a deep belief that rises out of some kind of lived experience that I can understand better and engage, even though I think she's wrong? And I'm not going to debate her about,
I'm in no rush.
All right, good.
I'm not going to debate her about trans people, but I will engage her world and the world of other people like that. So I think that's the hard part, right? So that's what creates this larger space in which we can have a conversation, is that we're willing to allow that and to be with the discomfort about it. I think part of the thing with civility too is you get lost and you get into these arguments and you just like, I don't know what to think about this person. I don't know what to think about what we're doing. I don't know how to manage this. And if we go back to these principles of deep civility, they give some guideposts for saying, okay, so we go back to first principles. What am I doing here and why is it a good thing? And that helps you orient yourself, because if you care, things get exciting, they get loud, they get passionate. And so finding your place in that is part of the job of strong civility. And now I think we're going to move to the interactive portion of our program.
Yeah, so if that kind of serves as the conclusion there for the two of you, I think that's maybe a really good place to transition. So the kind of expectations of how we're going to do this are in the chat.
I'm done.
Oh,
I'm Kathy.
hang on just a second, Kathy. We'll get to you, I promise, in just a moment. What we're going to do is use the hand raising feature, and if people are unsure about how to utilize that, you can kind of chat to our call managers. That's going to be really helpful just because we have so many people. And I imagine for myself, I have lots of questions that I would like to ask, but I know many others would as well. So we are going to utilize the hand raising feature, and I can see a couple up there. So go ahead and start to kind of throw yourself into the line, and I will do my best to get to people as I see them. And so let me just, one question that came as we were listening earlier, and I'll use this, one of the participants here kind of asked this question, how do you define being civil, right? So you alluded to some of this, it's, some of this is that language of like the eye of the beholder, the whole discussion you were having just about, what is across the line. How do you address that in this text? This idea of, obviously there's the strong and the weak, as you've explained it. Sorry about that, if the speaker. But the sense of where are those parameters, and how do we? Is it really the as you said at the end there, Bill, the sense of not debating one's humanity? Is that the line, or is there something else that's the line?
Oh, there's probably a couple different lines. So one of the things that part of the reason that this comes out of John Dewey's thinking, and I don't think he gets enough credit for kind of how sophisticated he is about this, is he says, look, basically any relationship enacts or doesn't the basic premise of democracy, that you treat the other person as an equal participant, right? That you give them that respect, not an object of your manipulation, not someone to be persuaded by you, dominated by you, bullied by you, but someone that you invite into a sense of mutual problem solving. Every relationship, two people in a room, still you can take one stance or the other stance. And so there's a certain sense in which politeness is a set of forms for what's kind of acceptable, et cetera, like this. And I think we think civility, especially strong civility, is when we take this stance toward each other as public people, right? And within your family, you can talk to people in this sort of public guise as well. But when you are trying to approach people as, it is my responsibility to treat you this way because you count as someone within this political community writ large that I believe in, that's the stance of civility.
Okay. Yeah, can I add, Tim?
Yes, please.
I just want to give as clear a definition as I can. And I'm not speaking, maybe I'm not speaking for Bill here, but for me, civility is a set of communication practices used to engage difference, capable of deepening a sense of community. So it's a specific set of communication practices that we use, and engage is important, engage difference and build a stronger sense of community. I don't think that's everyone's definition of civility, right, but it issues from what Bill just described theoretically.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, so this is, right, we're not looking for the universal here, but really for you. So I appreciate you saying that. So let me jump here. And so when I call your name, if you can unmute yourself, that would be great. So I see Al Smith has a hand raised. So if you could go ahead and pose your question.
Thank you. We have seen over the last 10, 15, probably 25 years in our government, especially in Congress, a total deterioration of civility. I mean, it's gotten to the point now through high partisan politics where there's demeaning of the other person, there's name calling the other person, which certainly doesn't lead to better relationships and trust. And the result is that we have a do-nothing government. It's really sad. Do you think there's any way to turn things around and bring civility to Congress?
Well, first of all, I would want to push back on total. Not everybody is guilty in the same way at all times. So it's not a total lack of civility. There are a lot of people at every level of government that are honorable, good, civil people who are working, right? But the bad actors stand out. They absolutely do. It's also true that people in that kind of national government institution, they're not you and I, right? The relationship to each other is different, right? Like, and you can look back to certain people like, you know, Ted Kennedy would cross the aisle, and he was famous for maintaining personal relationships with people that would allow him to bring people together, which either made him a great politician or a great compromiser, or maybe that's actually the same thing. In terms of changing the current situation, this is pretty hard to walk back, I think. I think the demand is going to have to come. Like, how many people actually don't like what's going on, right? So if you said, okay, so now we're going to be better, that would involve people praising people that they disagreed with, having relationships with people who are them, compromising with people who are them, and crafting solutions that work for both sides but are not perfectly pure for both sides. When the public demands that and says, we're going to praise that and reward that, that is when things will change. And so, I mean, I guess we have to see our own part in it, that, you know, in part, you know, it's gladiatorial combat because we're cheering.
So I want to add to that. I'm deeply skeptical right now that things will change. And I think it's in part because there are systemic pressures on political actors to act in uncivil ways. They get benefits from their incivility. I used to think that, yes, we could solve this problem if everyone just learned the practices of strong civility and we put them in action, we'd all be okay. But I don't think that's good enough right now, because there are systemic incentives to the kinds of incivility that I think you're describing that worry me deeply. And then I also worry that the social fabric has been so torn by the last 20 years. It might not be repairable. I mean, the reality is it won't be repairable in just a year, like a short-term thing. It's a long-term project to repair that social fabric.
So I'm going to interject here for just a moment. Apparently, we're getting many questions about Dewey, and
wonderful.
And maybe a really brief way to put this is, what would you point people to? Because I think as I'm sitting here in my office, I have 2 shelves of Dewey. So there are a lot of titles that I could think of, but I'd be interested what specifically. I think of Democracy and Education as one, potentially of interesting, The Public and Its Problems another. But when the 2 of you are talking about Dewey, maybe for those who are really interested in some of these questions, and as someone who was a kind of a formative voice in a lot of this work through the early 20th century, what would you point people to kind of learn more about Dewey, both maybe his own writings or those about him?
Yeah, so first I'd say that Dewey is a notoriously bad writer, so don't go looking to Dewey to enjoy what he's written. But Tim, I think the first place to look is The Public and Its Problems. The Public and Its Problems lays out the distinction between democracy as a system of government and as a way of life. And I think it's like one of the central texts of political theory in American history. And then Democracy as Education also is the second thing I look to, because in that book, he talks a lot about relationality and how transformative relationships are. And, you know, Dewey is famous for advocating for student-centered learning and for conceptualizing education practice as a kind of relationship between students and other students and teachers, and how those relationships are transformative, not just an information transmission sort of thing. So those are the 2 you picked are the 2 ones that I
okay. Well, that's, well, yeah. And I will note there's a very recent issue. I have the older versions of those, but there was just a reprint a few years ago. I believe Penn State University Press published the Public and Its Problems. So you can find it, I think, reasonably cheap, but there are many of them.
Very cheaply.
Yes. So
I'll put in a plug for, in 1905, Dewey wrote a book, which a friend of mine called the most pretentiously titled book ever, How We Think. Thanks for speaking for all of us. Actually, this is a really accessible book, and it's a guide to what he thinks is problem solving, right? Because at the root of everything is, for Dewey, a common orientation. What creatures do, what living creatures do is they solve problems of energy, reproduction, excretion, etc. And at higher levels, they solve problems that have to do with, you know, basic needs of human life, but also sociality, culture, and the rest of it. And so kind of embedded in our routines of living is this notion of, you know, problem solving. And so this book it's short, it's accessible, but it really brings, you know, there we go. It really brings into focus what he wants out of all of this. What he wants out of discussion is that people come together. There used to be a sort of standard agenda in meetings, definition of the problem, definitions of solutions, criteria for solutions, selection, right? A lot of people are probably familiar with this. And it comes straight out of how we think. People were so entranced by this, they turned it into a structure, which doesn't actually match the way people work very well, but that's okay. It is a useful thing to hang on to, and it's a useful guide as you start reading Dewey later. Some of this stuff becomes, he was born in 1859. He learned his writing practices in the 1870s, and the prose is thick. But if you cut through it, really that's the thing you can find at the heart of it. How do we solve problems together?
Thank you for taking a moment there to talk about Dewey. And I will point to, I was mentioning both of their other books, both really in significant ways draw on Dewey. So you may really be interested in some of both Rob and Bill's previous work for this reason. So let me jump back to some of the questions. I believe there was one that came a couple times. Matt Byrne, are you able to unmute?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Cool. Thank you both. I've heard pretty clearly so far, like a pretty persuasive case for the appreciation of complexity in a bunch of different contexts. And it got me thinking about how I think a common criticism I hear of that approach is that it's basically naive about how power works, or basically that it will, to refuse the race to the bottom is to basically lose. In the context of, either media choosing how to write their articles, or politicians, as you described, being under institutional influences. And my question is kind of, do you have any research or thinking on how to build in resistance to those incivility pressures, a sort of immune system sort of approach? Or any thoughts generally about that question?
Great, thanks.
Do you want to start?
So I can say something about power, which I think is implied in your question. Like the question, I can rephrase it as, does civility get you power? Because it looks an awful lot like incivility is what gets you power these days. And for me, I still am optimistic enough to believe that people like Saul Alinsky were right when they wrote about relationality at the core of social movements. So building up relationships as in a form of enacting or empowering people, and then leveraging that power of those relationships for transformative change. And I think we're seeing some of it on the ground these days in the kinds of social movements that are being enacted, and those relationships are formed in different spaces in different ways. So I'm not willing quite yet to just say incivility is the path to power and civility is not the path to power. I think you can still practice engaging relationality for the purposes of leveraging those relationships for political change and the acquisition of power. And I hope that that's what we're seeing in Black Lives Matter and in some of the recent protests. I'm not quite sure yet. I think that's what Occupy Wall Street tried to do, but it kind of fizzled out a little bit. It was an example of that relationality kind of trying to leverage power. But Bill, I don't know if you want to add or disagree.
Yeah, I think so. The question of why doesn't Dewey have a theory of power? Very common question, and it's completely fair. And one of the limitations of John Dewey is that all the work goes back to the small town in Vermont and the Congregationalist church that he grew up into, right? And you wouldn't really ask that question about that town because power was seated in the men and women who got to vote and do the various kinds of things. our society isn't structured like a small town, and a small town was homogenous, and right, there's lots of differences. But it's also true if you think about the civil rights movement, there's even within a large, diverse, dispersed country, and a country that's heavily mediated, there are ways to mobilize this. And here's where an interesting notion of incivility comes in, right? The criticism of Martin Luther King was he wanted graphic examples of horrible behavior that would strike the conscience of the nation, right? And Malcolm X's criticism was he thinks the nation has a conscience. Okay, but if you think the nation could potentially have a conscience, then providing those moments that galvanize people to suddenly say, wait, right? Dewey's idea is it begins with a sort of felt experience of a problem. Wait, there's something wrong here. And the Edmund Pettus Bridge and George Floyd both provide those moments where suddenly the rest of the larger power structures in abeyance, people come out into the street, things are overwhelming, statues are toppling, names are changing. We'll see how deep it goes. That's power too, right? So the question of how to mobilize that power, both from bottom up and from top down, the point of this organization, I think, is to mobilize resources bottom up for people to have the skills to step in at those moments and say, let's have this conversation, right? But there also has to be the other side where there are people who are organized, who are media savvy, et cetera, that can present this. So I think it's just more, right? There's one point of view that like, oh, come on, look, the levers of power are turned by this invisible group of people, and you people talking to each other doesn't matter. That is one point of view. I disagree with it. I'd be happy to challenge it. But there is a larger sense in which institutions and arrangements have inertia, and it's hard to change that. That's what makes Rob depressed about our current state. But they can change, right? So it is if people get together, right? So Dewey had a theory of power. His theory of power was the power of democracy and the power of discourse.
Great. There are lots of questions, lots of hands raised. They're coming through the chat. So I'm going to try to attend to these as much as we can. And so kind of keep them coming and being kind of prepared. Here's a question that I had as you were speaking earlier that was also echoed by somebody else. So I'll just kind of ask their question. What is this kind of strong civility, this kind of manner to engage the statement that there are, as you were talking about Charlottesville, right, that there are good people on both sides of those protests? What's the strong civility response to that issue and that particular notion that there were these kinds of balances as good people on both sides argument?
You mean like literally, like somebody says this to you and you say, man, that is completely messed up. What are you saying? Like strong civility, right, is where you can actually have a good enough relationship. You can get in somebody's face and say, what is going on in your head right now? Do you realize what you have just said, right? And that is only going to have an effect if you have a certain kind of relationship with somebody. Lecturing people anonymously in a blog comment or something like that, you're wasting your breath. But if you know somebody well enough and you can say, oh my God, you don't really think that X and Y group are subhuman, right? And explain to me how you justify this. That's what strong civility is. Weak civility is going, well, I guess you have your thing, I have mine.
Yeah, that last part is really important. So I think weak civility is the appearance of comfort, and strong civility is not. It requires engagement, deep engagement with difference. So you would be able to critique as long as the how you're doing it preserves and engages and maintains and confirms the relationship.
Yeah, and you have to be willing to do things like when the person comes back, you said, aren't liberals the real racists? Well, what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, you can just say, aren't you nuts? But if you engage that and say, well, what makes you think that? There's discrimination that goes on, or there's use of race in ways, it's like, okay, let's have a more complicated discussion about those things, right? I'm willing to engage that, even though it often makes me very uncomfortable, but it often leads to insights for both of us, right, about the way that race gets deployed in multiple contradictory ways in our society.
And Dewey's how we think, but discomfort can be transformative. Like discomfort is the problem that requires thinking about, that leads to transformation. So discomfort is part of strong civility also. I'm
gonna ask Jason to unmute himself and ask his question. I only see the name Jason, so I'm gonna hope there's only one of them.
Wow, I didn't think I'd be recognized. I think, I think a lot about this, and I think a lot of it deals with punching up versus punching down. So if we think about a lot of the civil rights leaders, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Steve Biko in South Africa, I mean, they fought injustice via incivility, by very strong comments, very strong actions. Sorry about my cat. And what civility does is it protects the majority. It protects the mainstream opinion. I mean, I was about to write a message like I think that BLM got a lot of their attention by incivility. Obviously, a lot of their gatherings resulted in destruction and rioting. Now, a lot of the civility says, well, a lot of it was peaceful, and a lot of civility has protected a lot of the discussion on that side. The Robin DiAngelo, who, I mean, clearly is in my opinion, is a virulent racist, but a lot of the mainstream media treats her with civility, and you cannot take on, you cannot take that on unless you are uncivil in some way.
Okay, so you are really going to enjoy this book. I recommend it to you in particular because it's aimed at exactly what you're talking about. And so just to start, I want to push back on a couple things. There's a lot of, just because you're talking back to people in power doesn't mean you're uncivil. The civil rights movement was mostly civil. Marching is civil, right? And the thing is, were there literally BLM protests which were organized for destruction? Or was that some people showed up and that happened to happen? Now, I realize America is the kind of place when we were talking about police killing people, people are like, and then a window gets broken there. Hey, wait a minute, that's property. I realize that is a terrible thing to me about our society, that the broken window makes people pay attention. But there's a whole bunch, I don't, like BLM, which we have a whole section in the book on this, their whole gist of it is completely civil. I don't see it as uncivil at all. I never understood why people thought kneeling at games was uncivil. We call this pseudo-civility. When somebody reacts with anger and says, well, how dare you do something that makes me uncomfortable or gives you some kind of moral leverage, that's uncivil. It's like, just because they say that doesn't make it true. And we have to be willing to ignore that, but also notice, right, because the whole gist of the MLK, right, the nonviolence thing was to actually sit within the bounds of this. Now, for us, strong civility, did he make people super uncomfortable? Did he drive people nuts with marching in certain neighborhoods and saying certain things? Yes, good for him, right? Like, that's okay. Now, are there moments where incivility is actually a real thing that needs to be done to push back against power? I think those moments exist. I think they're justifiable. I just don't think they're every moment. And I don't think they characterize all of what goes on in social justice and resistance to oppression. And I'll shut up and let Rob say something.
Yeah, I just real quickly, I think that we have heard the argument before that civility preserves the status quo. I think our argument is that pseudo-civility is an attempt to preserve the status quo by keeping everyone comfortable, but strong civility is actually not, and it can be transformative. So I see BLM also as an example of an action of strong civility, because there's an attempt to engage in a conversation with other citizens in the world in the country over a pressing issue. So that's why the distinction between weak and strong matters. Weak incivility can be a mechanism for preserving the status quo. Strong civility can be a mechanism for transformation or political change, in our view at least.
And that's why I wanted to define civility, strong civility, in terms of this like larger political relationship. You know, in the pre-Civil War era, the abolitionists were, in the South, like, how uncivil, don't you understand our way of life? It's like, well, your comfort with your culture is one thing, but the larger political issue of abolition of slavery is quite another. And so it isn't unstrong civil to be talking about this, even though in the weak sense, it's uncivil because you find it disruptive in this way, right? So, and the thing is, this has to run both ways. So there has to be the moment where people say things and you're like, why are you talking about this? You can't talk about this. This is terrible, right? There has to be a line somewhere, but the line better be pretty far off and pretty inclusive, or we are not actually going to be moving forward with this. And that's partly why Braver Angels is so interesting, because it's deliberately organized to bring sides together to make sure that there's an inclusiveness built into or baked into the idea of what you're doing. But that is actually a great question.
So let me, Meg Edwards, if you could unmute yourself in just a moment. And maybe as she's preparing to do that, a question that I, just as you're speaking, it made me think of an article from 1997 by Michael Schudson called "Why Conversation is Not the Soul of Democracy."
Soul of democracy, yeah.
It's a wonderful article, but the very tail end of it is all about the moments when we shouldn't have civility. And there's this line that, right, sometimes democracy requires this kind of withdrawal from civility itself. And it's the situations that I think, as you were alluding to, right, he says, we call these situations social movements, strikes, demonstrations, right? So this kind of breaking open, but as you were making a distinction here, there's still a civility of sorts in those moments, and maybe less so this kind of pseudo civility that we would otherwise kind of categorize as kind of one kind of monolith. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think pissing people off can be part of the strong civility, right?
Okay.
Like that is, once people pick up guns and say talking is over, okay, then we've left the field, right? And am I saying it's never, right? And so not just physical violence, but there are things, is that never? No, not never, right? And we had a whole civil war, it turned out, over abolition. It was really hard.
Yeah.
But still, right, this, and Schudson, the problem with that piece is this very inane view of conversation. Well, conversation is this trivial thing where people dance around and never really discuss anything. Well, okay, that's not the soul of democracy. Something more rigorous is the soul of democracy, and that's what we're trying to push for and to valorize.
Okay. Meg, Meg Edwards, are you all set to unmute?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you. I'm particularly interested in Rob's experience in academia, but also just in general. I run into a lot of people when I'm trying to talk about the idea of bipartisanship or civil discussions, people who will say things like, I don't have the emotional space to engage with people who believe this, or it's not safe for me to engage with people who believe this. And you mentioned, Bill, that there has to be a line when it's dehumanizing someone. But in our world where everything is personal, where all politics are identity politics, how do you pitch the idea of strong civility to people who feel like who really feel deeply uncomfortable in a personal way about engaging with, say, someone who doesn't think that trans people should be allowed to use the bathroom of their choice, those sorts of discussions that they do affect individual people, but maybe they're not necessarily across that line, and people have different backgrounds and reasons for believing things. How do you engage that side of the conversation?
Rob, do you want to start?
Go ahead. This is a really good question and a really tough one. So
this is a really tough question. So not all relationships are created equal, right? And so there is, in this public space, this kind of slightly weird idea that, okay, you believe this thing, and that is the only thing we know between us. And if that is the only thing we know between us, I'm out. Fair, but that's the only thing that we knew. There's nothing else going on, right? Because it's a different thing to get to know somebody in one context, and then you find out, wait, you're anti-gay marriage, you're this, you're that, like this. You look at it a really different way when you have this more rounded sense of what's going on, right? And so do people want to engage shallow public debate relationships where their humanity is at debate? No, they should walk away. Don't do that, right? I completely get that. On the other hand, can we foster relationships that are around, issues of public argument which don't immediately go there? Right, and I do understand the emotional space part too. God knows I have to turn off the TV. I don't watch TV. I turn off the news for 2 or 3 days at a time because I just can't take it. Like, it is very intense right now, and there is a kind of discipline that goes with this strong civility that, like, you have to steel yourself to, like, I am going to engage this because it's very uncomfortable, and you walk away, and sometimes you feel dirty, and you wonder, did I give too much? Did I listen to things? Did I not challenge enough? Right, like, you're going to be questioning yourself. I think that goes with the territory. It is it is hard. And if somebody is in a given place vulnerable, why should they engage their vulnerable part, right? Like that doesn't work. And if somebody else doesn't want to relent on that, like that's the only thing I really want to talk about with you is how you're not fully human. Like, okay, that person is not trying to have any kind of authentic relationship with you.
Yeah, I want to add too, so I can talk about when I work with my students. So this will happen with my students, and a student will say something like what you just said in the course of a conversation in class. And one of the things that worries me is that sometimes we have very limited repertoires for communication. So there's not a very wide pool of communicative tools we can draw from to engage another. And I think that's one of the things Bill was just describing there. It's like one person only wants to say X. I only want to engage you on topic X, or in mode Y, or something like that. And that's worrisome. And so what I tell my students is, okay, well, let's try and expand our repertoire of communication practices. Like what other communicative habits can we use here to engage this other person? Does it always work? No. And I think what Bill was saying earlier, like sometimes we do need to draw the line and say, I'm not engaging with that. Like that is out of bounds. And we're constantly negotiating where that line is. But if we have a really shallow set of communication, if we don't have much to draw from, then we're going to find ourselves in that position more often than not.
I had this experience this last year where I worked with another guy, chair of another department, who I'm a gun nut, I'm a crazy libertarian, like the most rigid and complete, devoted to Trump, everything you can imagine, but also in some ways a really sweet guy, right? And so I spent time, like, I'm not going to talk to you about that stuff because you make me crazy when you talk about it, but I'm going to spend time getting to know you about cars and your hobbies and all this other kind of stuff. And this put me in a position in certain places that he would say things in public meetings, meaning to provoke, and I could just make fun of him for it and he'd go, okay, fine, and he'd shut up. Right. And so did I change his mind? No. Did I prevent that from becoming something that derailed all of us with its unpleasantness? Yes. But that was work that I put into it. And genuinely, I do like him. I'm frustrated with him. I get angry at him. And I tell the Black Lives Matter march went past his house. And so he sat out on a porch with an AK-47 because just in case they were going to try some home invasion. Like, really, Stephen? That happens all the time in all white suburbs, like where you live, sure. And he's like, well, I don't, it's like, and everybody laughed him down and that was kind of the end of it. Did I change his mind? No. Did I take it off the table? Yes. And defang it to a certain extent. Did he allow that? And he's still cool with me and he still talks to me and we're still friends. That took work. That's hard to maintain. And when I interact with him, I do question myself, but I feel like it's better to be there than just to say, I shut you out.
Tara Wheatland, if you could unmute yourself, it would be great to have your question.
Hi, thanks. So other than one sort of offhand mention, I haven't heard you guys specifically talk about social media that much. And I guess I'm wondering, at least for me, I've so effectively surrounded myself in my real life with people that I largely agree with on most things that I find that the most common space I have when to like disagree with people and, argue with them is on social media. And it's a fraught space a little bit because I think those conversations can happen in a context that's sort of like divorced from a relationship that you might have with the person you're arguing with, right? Maybe you're arguing with like your uncle or the guy who's on your softball team, speaking from personal experience, but also, there's, news stories and comment threads that are just sort of divorced. And I'm wondering whether, how much of this you think can apply to help. I mean, it doesn't seem to me the right decision to just sort of abandon social media comment sections to the winds, unless we can eliminate them. But how can we use any of these tools in social media in a way that doesn't just make you crazy?
Yeah, that's a tough question too. So I just finished this book called Anti-Social Media, and it confirmed my already existing opinion, so I like the book. But my already existing opinion was that the systems of social media are driven by attention, like they want attention. So they get attention from the rhetorical practices of incivility, from hyperbole, from reification. They get that attention by using specific communication practices that we know are antithetical to strong civility. So that's a big problem. Like, how do you solve that big problem? At the same time, we end the book with an example from a Reddit group that's devoted to change, to changing people's minds. And that Reddit group has specific rules for participation. And the rules for participation are basically the rules for a strong civility. And it's a kind of productive group. The problem is that, like, Facebook is a corporation that profits from attention. And so, like, as long as that system is in place, it's going to be antithetical to the practices of strong civility, as far as I can tell. And it's going to be more these kind of niche spaces, like on a subreddit that has its own kind of rules to govern conversation. But Bill, I don't know if you want to add to that. A lot of communication scholars these days are writing about how social media is actually destructive of the social fabric. It weakens ties between people, it strengthens polarization. So, I mean, it's hard to see how one could enact strong civility through social media for me. But
well, at a certain point, this looked like it revealed, again, the bias in Dewey towards small town life, that you have these relationships with people that you know personally, et cetera. And, you know, this is the guy who wrote Bowling Alone, says, you know, basically, okay, so your tendency to demonize somebody for bringing up a proposal at the school board is much less if you go to church with that person and your kids are on the same soccer team and you see them at this all the time, right? So you're not going to demonize them because you know them as a complex person. People can have complex and long-lasting relationships on media, on social media. Actually, does anybody remember Usenet, the 1990s? My wife was in a group, alt.food, and she has friends that she has had since 1992, and it's migrated to new platforms, but she's known these people. They're beginning to die now, and right, you can have long-term rich relationships. It isn't exactly that, but when media is structured for drive-by engagement, the stuff that Rob is talking about, where people have zero history relationships, and it encourages you to merely score points. It doesn't encourage anything beyond that. I mean, I have to say that, anybody on the Nextdoor app, you do this? Or yeah, okay. So, and I put up a complaint about noise from a stadium near me, and a woman started mocking me for this, and I was mad. So but I didn't react. I waited a day and got unmad a little bit, and I said, okay, I just honestly want to know why it's important for you to mock me. You know, my being unhappy with this doesn't hurt you. If I get the solution I want, it doesn't harm you at all. Why do you need to talk to me this way? I'm still waiting for the reply, but I'm going to be honestly interested if I get it, right? Because I think people they take pleasure in this. It's like pulling the wheel on the slot machine, right? It's just this little tiny dopamine hit, and it's good, and they move on. But this is not a good model for overall. It's not that you can't do it at all, but it's a terrible model for what you do. So then the question is to have better media, more social, actually social instead of anti-social media. How do you build structures and motivations that aren't Zuckerberg's for people to develop these sort of more functional, healthier, more authentic relationships?
Great, thanks. I'm going to go to another question. We've got lots of hands, so if we're okay to go with just a little bit longer, that would be great. Catherine Holcomb, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, sorry for the slight delay.
No, that's totally fine. I teach a lot online, so I know the delay of finding the mute button. So
yeah. Okay, thanks. My question's kind of related to Meg's, coming from the perspective of education. I'm wondering what you think about like the idea of a safe space. In my experience, a lot of people on the right kind of take issue with the parameters of safe space and how it might infringe upon free speech. And so, you know, teaching high schoolers from different political backgrounds, and from, I guess, coming from a family that's divided politically too, I wonder if you think safe spaces, which are, you know, what even is that, probably look different and can be defined in different ways, but maybe in particular, like limitations or guidelines on people's language, if that hinders or harms civil discourse.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I sometimes wonder if safe space is an invention of the people who critique it. Like there is no widespread, my campus has nothing like this, right? You know, there's various centers for kinds of students, and there are places where people gather to be with like-minded people, and I guess that's safer, but there's no like dedicated safe room. The way people talk about this, I don't know, it doesn't jive with my experience. On the other hand, civilly, if someone says, I find that super offensive, I think it's demeaning to me, and here's why, I think that's something worth listening to, right? And so people say, oh, you're a snowflake, or you want a safe space or something like this. That's even as strong, that's an uncivil response, right? And it's really, you know, how does that really help anything? If you have a particular way that you describe yourself and you're like, I would ask you to use my name, maybe pronounce it right and describe me the way that seems like a minimal request to acknowledge, you know, in public respect, somebody, and not say, no, I'm just not going to. Right, so that is a minimal thing. You don't need a space to do that. And so, is this the language police? Not really, but within a given set of interactions, do you have the right to ask for this and expect it in return? That is civility.
I think that, so there's a lot of crying in my classes, so maybe they don't have But
I don't make my students cry, Rob.
I don't make them cry. I don't know why, but there is crying. So that can't be a sign that I have safe spaces in my classes, at least. But I would answer this way. I'm always talking to my students and getting them to reflect on how they choose to engage one another. So the question of how is at the forefront of their minds. And they have to reflect on how they're choosing to engage one another. And they have to reflect on the fact that some hows are actually damaging and hurtful to others. And for me, the classroom is the place to learn how to not do that and to engage in a more productive how. So they have to kind of go through this step where they don't engage one another very effectively. Sometimes it's harmful. And then they have to repair the relationship and figure out how to transform their how practices, all while thinking through this problem. And that, to me, that's learning. That's kind of what Dewey says is learning also, by the way. So I teach the way Dewey would have told us to teach. So I guess I'm saying I'm not sure I'm endorsing safe spaces. I'm endorsing a critical reflection on how we choose to engage one another as a central question of communication practice for democracy and for education, period, for both things broadly.
And I have become sensitized to it, and I think it's fair to acknowledge there are people who, over their identity and other kinds of life circumstances, have experienced a lot of trauma, and they can get triggered, right? This isn't everybody who is in X group or whatever, but there are people who are like that, and it's like, if somebody says, don't pick on me here, don't do this, you should respect that too. And if you say, well, no, I have the right to say anything I want, well, you have the right to be a jerk. It's like, so if the person asks you not to be a jerk, I have to say I taught public speaking for many, many decades, and you have speeches and people say things. And I always wondered if it was my job to say something about particular language or way in which a speaker characterized a group. Students never failed me. Well, one time, but 100%, mostly they did not fail me. And I would just wait, and somebody would go, you know, that word for talking about these people, I really have a problem with that. And they're not one of these people, but they're like, I have a problem with that. And the person's like, well, what are you saying? It's like, I'm saying it's really unfair. And well, why? And so then this leads to a discussion, and usually the person's like, well, okay, I just grew up with that, or I didn't think anything. It's like, well, okay, now we know. Okay, so okay, fine. And it usually goes that way. And of course, there are these public settings where people are super entrenched, and they have, you know, an entertainment or ideological reason for saying, I'm never giving up on this language. You know, some TV show host doesn't want to pronounce Kamala Harris's name right because that might actually make her seem like a credible. Okay, that's entertainment. I don't really care about that. In most settings, people try really hard to treat each other decently when they find out what that is. They do. And so, you know, there's the college setting, there are people with trauma, there's different kinds of cases. And I think we should, you know, try to protect people as much as we can. But I don't think there's a danger to democracy and asking for respect.
So there's a very interesting, I'll just mention it here and then I'll jump to a question, a book that was written last year by the president of Wesleyan. In fact, it's called Safe Enough Spaces. And so in fact, it's in line with what we're talking about here, but it's also from this kind of pragmatist approach to inclusion, free speech, and political correctness on college campuses. It's a very small volume. It's not on this shelf, it's at a home shelf right now, but it's an interesting text, but it raises, I think, similar to what you're talking about, how do we, and as Catherine kind of asked this, how do we think about these kind of competing values? And as your subtitle suggests, we need to be able to have some of those more robust and significant interactions to maybe afford ourselves to get to that place, rather than the social media question before, the sometimes superficial interactions that are more for our own benefit and kind of intrigue, rather than actually coming to understand or know why the person or persons have the view or the experience that they do. Let me ask a real quick question. I'm going to jump back into this. I've gotten this, and it's kind of really topically related. Can you reflect a little bit on this theme of, because the safe space, the free speech, all intersects a lot, and you alluded to a little bit of J.K. Rowling earlier, and the Harper's letter that had a lot of traction a number of weeks ago. Where does this intersect with what's referred to as cancel culture, right? And how does this relate to this idea of strong civility or strong incivility?
So all these things, like cancel culture ends up being sort of a club that's used by various people to beat up other various peoples. And the reality of it is probably more diverse. I always end up saying the same thing, right? Like, it's more complicated and nuanced, and okay, I'm an academic, but I think that's actually kind of real, but it is true, right? Like, so is cancel culture real, that we have to now pretend this person doesn't exist and never allow them into public discourse again? People try that. Does that keep the person out? I don't know. It's not going to keep J.K. Rowling out of anything. I mean, she's extremely wealthy. And if her fandom has complex relationships with her, and some of them want to break up with her and then get back with her and go through a whole process, like that's okay. She's not really harmed. I think at lower levels, when people are shunned for apparently espousing forbidden beliefs, whatever the context is, that's probably not particularly civil. I mean, are there people who should be shunned? Yeah, we had the pedophiles, the cannibals, Nazis. There's a list of people who just really don't deserve in that part of themselves to be part of the conversation. But there is a tendency to say that, like, look, if you have one bad belief, it implicates all the bad beliefs, and it implicates all the structures of power. And so if you let that in, you've let it all in. And so this person has to be shut out, because any impurity becomes all impurity. And I think that is probably that is corrosive, and that is dangerous. It's not quite that easy. These are hard issues, though, and I don't have settled opinions about it.
Can I try to answer that also?
Yes,
I want
please.
to add that, so I don't really believe that there's any such thing as free speech. We're always regulating speech all the time already anyway. I think this debate about cancel culture is just an indication of what we've already been doing for hundreds of years, which is deciding where the line is between what gets excluded and included in public discourse. And we're just adding some things that we'd like to exclude from public discourse, and we don't know where the line is, and that's okay. And we're going to redraw it, and it's being redrawn in front of us. So it's not all the things, I don't think everything should be canceled. Some of the things I think, yeah, that should probably be canceled. It's just an example of what we were already doing anyway, which is regulating speech and drawing lines about what's in and out of bounds for public conversation. And some people are really angry about it because some things are being drawn out of bounds that they would really prefer to remain in bounds, because the things that they would prefer to remain in bounds preserve the status quo for those people. And so it's dangerous to rule those things out of bounds sometimes. But hey, that's life in a democracy as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
There's some rough and tumble.
Yes, indeed. It is not a clean situation. Luke Phillips, I think you had a question that you were going to ask, if you could unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And Bill and Rob, thank you for all this. This is just really, really good and interesting stuff to think about on all fronts. Bill, real quick note, you've talked about cannibals a little bit. I just wanted to mention that a couple hundred years ago, Michel de Montaigne, the great French essayist, said that cannibals could actually be kind of nice people in some ways. So a historical note there.
It depends on how the person becomes food.
That's true. I'm mostly joking. So anyways, I did have a question though. So I am philosophically and politically and temperamentally conservative on most things. And so as the kind of discourse went from like conservatives being on the ascendancy during the Obama years towards progressives being on the ascendancy during the Trump years, just in terms of the public discourse, I've like had a lot of whiplash thoughts. But I came across a quote by the feminist philosopher Elizabeth Anderson about a year ago, which I've been wrestling with in my mind. And I just wanted to know how you, Bill and Rob, assessed this particular, I guess, sociological take. So she says, and it's a quick quote, I'm something else at home, I'm something else with my friends. The ability to not have an identity that one carries from one sphere to another sphere, but rather to be able to slip in and adopt whatever values and norms are appropriate while retaining one's identities in other domains. That is what it means to be free. And she's talking, of course, about being in a pluralistic society and being able to be in a religious setting one time, in a civic setting another time, in a political setting one time, in a work setting one time, and be able to be very diverse from other people, and maybe even have identities and beliefs that the others find like totally abhorrent and like need to be expunged from society, and yet be able to still coexist. So I just wanted to bring that quote into this and ask your general assessments on to what degree pluralism is required for democracy versus to what degree consensus or like generally approaching consensus is required for democracy.
Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am vast, I contain multitudes. America's great gay poet has, right? So I think this is actually really a crucial thing. And so that at the end of the first chapter of the book, we have a whole thing on liberalism, based a little bit on Adam Gopnik's recent book on, I can't remember the name of it, 1,000 Small
Sanities, yeah.
What's that?
1,000 Small Sanities.
1,000 Small Sanities. And so he figures liberalism is basically a pluralist thing. If you're going to have freedom in society, then you're going to have a vast set of contradictory arrangements that don't all work with each other, right? The point of fascism or totalitarianism is from top to bottom, it's the same. The fasces, right, the origin of this was the Roman image of the sticks bound together. And so each stick can be broken easily, but as a bundle, they're strong. And so strength out of unity. And no, our strength has to come from someplace actually completely different. And so there is both a pluralism and a fallibilism put into this, right? We try to make things better. We have different conceptions of the better, but we try to make things better. And every time we do, we create a new set of problems. Then we step back, wipe off the forehead, and then start to work on those problems. That is the nature of liberal democracy. And so people who expect perfect outcomes, people who think that we're converging toward a perfect future, it just really isn't like that. Because if you get that, what did you give up to get that? You gave up basically this larger sense of freedom. And so, yeah, we have to tolerate a certain kind of pluralism. And Rob is absolutely right? Like, if you went back 50 years talking about gay sex in public and the legitimacy of people being homosexual or whatever, completely over the line. Like, why are you talking about this? And I've met older men who are like, God, back in the day, we never mentioned it. Oh my God, it's terrible. Why do these people talk about it? Well, that's totally changed. And so I have to hold out that I'm picking on cannibals, but there might come a time where, you know, there's a certain kind of respectable sort of eco-friendly take on this, which makes it look, so yeah, not yourself. I'm but 2 miles from where Jeffrey Dahmer did his work. So it's a kind of a bad issue around here because that was actually very cruel. But if you could come up with a non-cruel version of it, maybe at some point in the future, I could be persuaded that it's not over the line in that way. But there are other things which are anti-liberal and anti-pluralist, which have to be over the line, right? Because that is definitional.
So we have just a few more questions that I see that I'd like to get to as I'm watching the clock here too, to be mindful of that. Catherine Rohde, or Rode.
Rhodey, yes.
Rhodey, fantastic.
I feel like you guys have sidestepped the question around cancel culture because that's on the left and it's ideological purity and it's illiberal. there is a left that's arisen in academia and in other liberal institutions, where if you are afoul of a particular type of idea, if you look, for example, what happened to the professor at Evergreen, where he was chased out of town by students because he didn't would absent himself from the day of. But I am in an organization where a long history. It's of liberalism, liberal thought, a kind of guiding light is how we test ideas and we come to a greater truth. And there has been a rise of people saying, you can't talk about these things because it will cause harm or cause trauma or whatever. And it's not it's not big things. I spoke at a debate saying I believed everyone should have a right to the lawyer, and the next speaker got up and said, "Oh, she's caused trauma. She shouldn't even have said that." And that kind of discourse is becoming much more problematical. People are getting fired. You had the folks at Yale who talked about a Halloween costume and ended up having to leave the university, great scholars, it's under the radar, but it's on the left. And I'm a longtime liberal. I'm daughter of liberals, and I've always been in social movements. But I find this really disturbing, and the inability to discuss important issues like civil rights or feminism or any of those things without getting canceled, I think is detrimental to civil conversation and democracy. And I think ignoring that on your part is problematical.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. I don't. You want to respond, Bill or Rob?
Well, first of all, we don't ignore. We have a lot of stuff. It's 200 pages of creamy goodness, and so there's a lot in there that didn't come out in this conversation. But also, it's like I'm not quite clear. So it's not just liberals, right? So if there are anti-liberal elements, every community, every belief system, every side, if there's conservatives, is going to have anti-liberal elements. And so the question is, right? So I do get it. I know that this exists. I worked at a university, right? But simply saying, well, these people, well, what about that, right? So there are strong communities where the communities try to form themselves around given values. If you don't belong in that community, it's bad. In the larger picture, right, I think what you see are swings back and forth as people explore things. And so as people understand systemic racism, patriarchy, sexualities, right, and the way in which people who are in certain positions experience a kind of daily trauma, as this awareness grows on people, what also grows with them is like, wow, there are just all these things we do all the time that make it worse, right? So then they start trying to figure out really fast, how do we stop doing this? How do we stop other people from doing this? And that's the part that you're reacting to, right? So I think it's not long-term sustainable. I think to a certain extent, knowing people, it comes from a good place, but it's going a place which is not really very helpful. There's personal costs for people. I think it happens in conservative circles, happens in religious circles, happens in all sorts of circles. And so it has to be resisted, but also resisted relative to what is the scope of this and what is it really about, right? They're really trying to protect people, and protecting people is a good thing. What has been given up? So if you have competing obligations of civic life, you have an obligation to no harm, but you also have this obligation to the larger difficult conversation, and balancing those things out at any one moment or in any larger context is a set of ethical decisions, right? And so I'm willing to allow that other people would make different judgments than I would, and that I think that they're wrong. Rob, what's your thought?
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly so that we can get to some other questions. Purity worries me because, and it returns to the question of how one engages in the attempt to draw the line between what's in and out of public discourse. So if one engages in the practice of drawing that line from a position of purity, it can have troublingly illiberal results. And I think what Bill and I are trying to describe is a way of engaging in drawing that line that would not result in those kinds of illiberal outcomes, and would not be from that place of purity. So it depends on the cases that we're talking about, to me. Yeah, let me leave it at that, because to me, I think you want to get a couple other questions.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, so we have 5, and I'm gonna.
5.
Yes, we have 5 left. If we could do these.
You guys are engaged. That's awesome.
I mean, this is the stuff you said you want. So if Michael, if you could unmute, and if we could have a kind of a pithy question here, or if you make it as concise as possible, that would be really great. And the response.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So my question is about this notion of preserving of status quo, and it implies that it's bad to preserve the status quo. And if our status quo is mostly liberal, mostly democratic, mostly civil society, maybe we have to try to preserve it. But the problem is that, as we see for last maybe few decades, it becomes more and more problematic, because it does not work not only for everyone, it does not work even for strong partisans, because they cannot accomplish their goals. When they are taking power, they are ignoring the other side, and they are causing a strong backlash, that so they cannot achieve even their own goals. And most Americans, as I know, about 90%, they also feel that we have too much polarization in our life. So this is something that maybe we have to try to heal in our system, and not to try to dismantle everything. What do you think about this? And maybe one question, how can we reduce this polarization among our politicians? We have to elect the different kind of politicians. If we realize that politicians who are so strong partisans, they cannot really achieve what we want. So,
thank you, Michael.
Yeah, so that's a really smart question, and there's a couple different answers I think that are floating around. One is a guy at Penn State, John Gassel, wrote a book this year about saving democracy, and his idea that a lot of it is structural, right? So it's not that you need a different kind of politician in the sense that like you need a more virtuous person, right? Because virtuous people put into a system that forces them to deform themselves will become those people. You need a system with a different reward structure. And so it requires an overhaul of the institutions. And of course, it's difficult because the people in them are not inclined to. But I think the other thing is there's 2 status quos. There's the aspirational status quo, right? Is America a democracy? No, we're a republic, right? Like we have a certain set of institutions. But democracy, that word in America, represents an aspirational set of relationships. And that's a kind of status quo. And then there's the status quo of the institutions that we actually have. And the tension between those is the ongoing issue, and is the focus of a lot of, like, you know, obviously we can have things working in some ways, but then if you're a minority person, it's not working for you. So how do we have the idea, the aspiration of a good system, how do we bring the real system we have closer to it?
Great. I'm going to be judicious here as we're trying to pose our questions. So Larry Kittiver, could you unmute?
Got it. Okay, thank you. Yes, you talked a little bit about trauma. How do you deal with people that have unusual backgrounds, that maybe give them phobias, that maybe give them certain needs, or you have people who have fear, dominated by fear, and they don't let you know that? How do you deal with people who have needs like to be loved, to be right? They must be stroked. They need to attack you. They need to win. They need to quote scripture in a sense to prove that what they say is derived by some transcendental person who uses maybe history to try to defeat you. So how do you deal with that kind of person who has all these hidden things driven by fear and experiences that have determined how they feel?
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and also a difficult question. This is something, a version of what my students often ask me, a very similar version of that question. So I think that I'll contradict myself from earlier. I think it is about using your communicative practices to create a safe space for them so that you can form a relationship with them that will be transformative. So like I deal with this every day as chair of my department. People are reactive, they're not thoughtful. So you say something, they just react strongly from a place of emotions. Well, you have to let them have their reaction and absorb it and diffuse it before you can get to the deliberative moment where you're actually making a decision and reasoning with that person. If the other person reacts and then you react to their reaction, you just get the kind of disconfirmation of the relationship that we were talking about. You get the kind of fracturing or breaking up of the relationship. So you have to do this kind of repair work to allow them to have the space of their reaction about fear or whatever it is before you get to the deliberative moment. So I think Bill and I both are concerned with deliberation and with reasoning together, but we're both aware that it's really hard to get to that place where we can reason together. And what you're describing is one of the things that makes it so hard, because people are in these positions, they have these positions that prevent them from getting to that space. But it doesn't unburden us from helping those people arrive in that location so that they can deliberate reasonably, I say. So you have to think carefully about what set of practices that can draw them into that space. And you're just not exempt from that, even though they're maybe nasty to you sometimes because they're reactive, et cetera.
Yeah, great. Oh, sorry, Bill.
Just one really quick one.
Yep.
Like sometimes I feel like we're doing two different things. Like I think I'm in a pottery class and we both put our hands on the piece of clay as it spins and we both are creating this thing between us is what I'm doing and the other person's doing MMA. And that's the moment where I feel like Larry is talking about, we're like, wait, what? Because you just can't get yourselves into the same activity and the person seems so invested in not doing that.
Yeah. Julie Bowler, if you could.
Hey, thank you. This is probably a question about how you guys keep yourselves honest and put yourselves in situations that are challenging to you. I can just say as a staunch blue, I'm excited to see how much I've internalized the culture of Braver Angels because it was so jarring to me to hear you talk about your neighbor who's even a Trump supporter and a gun-toting, right-winger, however you described him. You went on to talk about finding common ground and so forth, but, in the context of talking about being, reductionist, dismissive, stereotyping, it was just jarring, like I said. So I just,
to be fair,
and you're human and it's hard, so.
Those were his words for himself. Those were not my words. That is how he liked to present himself.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, it just, the overall description came across as reductionist, but I mean, that's just, we're all human and it's tough.
And that was my frustration with him. He presents himself as this reductionist political stereotype, and actually there's much, much more to him.
Yeah, which I think you were alluding to a little bit earlier of like the complexity of having your positions be rather different in many respects, but still maintaining that relationship for a variety of reasons, right? As you were saying earlier. Yeah. Thank you, Julie. And Indy Rishi Singh, if you could.
Hey guys, thank you so much for showing up and being available, and what amazing conversation. And I'm sure more conversation will come from this. So I have two things, question, whatever. One is I'm available for any sort of lobbying. I'll gladly become like a mindful lobbyist out there. So if any of you guys want me to go and do some lobbying and go out there and schmooze some politicians and use like use like healthier living and healthier habits and maybe enjoying life more as a way to kind of get them kind of open up. I feel there's something about like the ancient times that, you know, whether you go to India or China, or you go to Greece, when things were working really well, the leaders were practicing well-being. They themselves were practicing how to live healthier and better, and their decision-making kind of had a also kind of like flowed with that, you know. And I feel like whether you're a Republican, Democrat, whatever, people are suffering, and if they're suffering, if they're miserable, they're going to share that misery. So if you guys have any connections to lobbying groups, or you guys want to,
Indy, could we, if you got a kind of pointed question here?
Yeah. So the question is, do you guys have any guys researched like Indian political theories, ancient Chinese political theories, and how they adapted, how they kind of helped create a better, more civil society through those means, you know, the Eastern philosophies and whatnot?
All right, so yeah, so a lot of our references have been to, you know, to Dewey and to others, kind of the Western kind of canon of kind of dialogue and deliberation here, of discussion. This question about kind of Eastern traditions. Would you like to respond to that one?
I think there's, I don't have something deep to say about this. It's not that I don't know anything about it, but a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I think there are strong resonances. I mean, I wouldn't want to romanticize other cultures and their histories, which were often violent and oppressive. And in periods of peacefulness, the peace was only a good thing for part of the people who live there. But on the other hand, I think there are deep, you know, within the Confucian tradition, you can find deep resonances for, right, well, how do we find the balance between our individuality and our community? There are Indian traditions of argument and debate, which are very explicit about bringing rationality into public affairs. Of course, the classical Greek context is one that's very important for people who are educated in the European tradition, although they were not without violence and without practices that we would find abhorrent. There are things that we can take away from it that are very useful. I mean, I think there is a comparative cultural study that could be done here.
And maybe we'll draw one last question. David Arlington has been, David M. in Arlington, Virginia. I'm realizing that's probably a place, not your name. So David.
Yeah, I'm David in Arlington, Virginia. Yeah, my question is, have either of you thought about the possibility that the two-party system can't work in the kind of culture we have in America today, where we have the most diverse population in the world, I think, in terms of immigration, large-scale immigration from around the world, where we have a very rich and mobile society. When I was growing up, the assumption was you had to learn to live with your neighbors. You couldn't move away. You were stuck with your family and your relationships. My children grew up in an era where they could move to the place where they would find people that thought like they did. And that kind of mobility, I think, is causing us to break down into red and blue states, and then we become so polarized. And the polarity is driven by the fact that there are only two parties.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's what I was saying earlier about a structural or systematic problem that lends itself to incivility. And I think what you're pointing to is one of the features of the system that structures communicative practice in a way that's unhelpful or opposed to strong civility. If you have two parties and only two parties, it's really easy to practice a rhetoric of division and identification. So you just strengthen the identification inside one party and divide yourself from the other party. If you had 4 or 5 parties, it's going to be harder. It's going to be more complicated to pull that off rhetorically. So in Canada, we have 4 major federal political parties that have seats in parliament, and they're still liberal conservative at both ends, but it's harder for them to draw stronger polarized borders or boundaries between the two of them. So I think you're right. I think that that's a feature, a systemic feature of the system that makes it more likely to get incivility and less likely to get versions of strong civility in our political discourse.
The parliamentary framework has a lot of attractions, right? When you have many parties and nobody has an absolute majority, you have to do compromises, right? People have to work with each other. And today's friend is tomorrow's enemy, so you better preserve those relationships. And I don't know how you get there from here, but they used to describe American politics as two elephants fighting over a dime on the 50-yard line. Like, you know, the parties were indistinguishable. Now that they've pulled back and they're more distinguishable, having only two of them doesn't look like such a good idea, right? And so I totally take this to be, we've got to find some structural solutions, but of course, from within the structure that we have, it's going to be difficult to get there.
So I'm mindful of the time, and I want to first say thank you very much to both William Keith and Robert Danisch for taking the time this evening to share their recent book, Beyond Civility, The Competing Obligations of Citizenship. It just came out from Penn State University Press. The links, if you go to the chat box, you will find various options for locating it, and you can see a photo of it in real life there. I would strongly encourage you to find it. It's also very reasonably priced, so it's always a helpful thing, especially for academic books or things that look academic in that sense. I will just say I've been really appreciative of the discussion tonight. Thank you to all of the participants, the questions that were posed, and frankly, the discussion that came up amongst all of us. This, I think, in some ways embodies this idea of being able to be in conversation, to have some push and pull, a little bit of tension at moments, but to sustain that conversation of, I think, Rob, you said it well earlier, to paraphrase, right? How do we live well with one another? And this is one of these essential pieces, us to be able to recognize the complexity of ourselves and others, and to find ways to have more constructive communication with them that, as you argue, is really rooted in this sense of strong civility, rather than this kind of pseudo or kind of weak, the superficial perspective on civility. So I want to say thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Great job moderating this discussion tonight. And Bill and Rob, wonderful stuff, wonderful comments, and just a fascinating thing. Thank you for doing what you're doing. And thank you to everybody else who came here tonight to have this interesting and important theoretical conversation that has so many practical applications in real life the longer we go into things. So I'm just going to give the mandatory brief spiel on Braver Angels and what exactly we do. So what you just sat through for the last 2 hours is one of the events in Braver Angels and the National Institute for Civil Discourse's partnered series of events called America's Public Forum, where we bring together thinkers and intellectuals and activists and practitioners on any number of important problems in American public life. And we engage them in a constructive dialogue on the kinds of things that they're thinking about. And we have them, and then we open it up to questions and answers from ordinary Americans like you and me right after that. And we do these once a week, every week, Wednesday nights, but we may be doing more moving forward. But these are just one of the ways that we're trying to get more interesting conversations on this front. Now, Tim mentioned a little bit about the National Institute for Civil Discourse. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Braver Angels before we let you go. Braver Angels is the nation's largest fully bipartisan, grassroots-led organization committed to fighting political polarization and helping bring Americans together and see each other as fellow Americans across the political divide, across the racial divide, across the class divide, across all these divides that are dividing us, especially now in this most interesting, controversial, and ultimately unsatisfying of election seasons. We have a lot of stuff going on. We have all kinds of debates. We have all kinds of workshops. And we have these America's Public Forums going on every week. And we are always looking for more participants. In the links that you saw there are links both to see what Braver Angels does and how you can get involved with Braver Angels. Now, if you're ever interested in getting involved with us as a volunteer, please come. We really, really, really need more people to help bring this kind of message and this kind of work and this kind of opportunity to more and more of our fellow Americans who are suffering in this polarizing age, just as much as all of us in this room are. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact us through the links that you've seen, or feel free to shoot us a message through the link that you saw. And lastly, just on a personal note, I agreed with a lot of the things that Bill and Rob said about the nature of polarization and the nature of civility. And the thing that I found really interesting over the course of listening to them is that the things that they're discussing at levels of deep research and deep political science and stuff are questions that are relevant not just because they're political, but because we in the depolarization space come to those exact same questions and have to assess them in ways that are sometimes similar, sometimes different to the way that they are. And doing this work, humbling yourself, being charitable to other people is one of the things that's most important for democracy, as any slight trip on social media can let you know. So if you ever wanted to do something that could help your country out in a time where it needed it most, Braver Angels is here. We're looking for more hands, and we're always happy to work with anybody who wants to work with us. So with that, I just extend that offer from the whole Braver Angels family nationwide to all of you. And I'd like to thank you for coming to our event tonight. Looking forward to seeing you at another one.
Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate it.